A ruthless CEO threw away an urgent letter from a dying woman without reading it, focused only on his next million-dollar deal. 2 years later, a small girl appeared at his office with the same letter and a revelation that made his empire start to crumble. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Leave a like to keep following our upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to receive more incredible stories like this one. Michael Foster stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office, watching the city below with the detached interest of someone who had long since stopped seeing beauty in anything but profit margins. At 42, he had everything society deemed valuable: CEO position at Foster Enterprises, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and enough money to buy whatever he wanted. Yet, he felt nothing. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Foster, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes, Mary, his assistant, reminded him. He straightened his custom-tailored suit and grabbed the portfolio from his desk. Another day, another series of decisions that would make him richer and, somehow, emptier. The board meeting dragged on as expected: quarterly reports, profit projections, acquisition proposals. Michael handled each topic with the cold efficiency that had earned him the nickname "the Machine" among his employees. As the meeting concluded, Richard Thompson, his mentor and the company's former CEO, pulled him aside. "Excellent presentation, Michael. You've become everything I hoped you would be." The older man's praise felt hollow, just like everything else. Later that afternoon, Mary entered his office with a stack of papers requiring his signature. "Also, sir, there's someone waiting to see you in the lobby." "I don't take unscheduled meetings," Michael replied without looking up. "Sir, it's a little girl. She says it's important." Michael finally raised his eyes from his computer screen. "A what?" "A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She's been waiting for hours. Send security to escort her out." Mary hesitated. "Sir, she has a letter. She says it's from her mother, Jessica Parker." The name hit Michael like a physical blow, though he kept his face carefully neutral. Jessica Parker, a name he hadn't heard in nearly a decade. "Fine. 5 minutes." The girl who walked into his office was small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore clean but worn clothes, and her sneakers had holes at the toes. But it was her eyes that caught Michael's attention, determined brown eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice surprisingly steady for someone so young facing someone so intimidating. "My name is Emily Parker. My mum wanted you to have this." She held out an envelope, wrinkled and obviously handled many times. Michael took the letter without opening it. "And why couldn't your mother deliver this herself?" Emily's chin trembled slightly, but she kept her composure. "She died 2 years ago. Cancer. She made me promise to find you when I was old enough to make the trip alone." Something uncomfortable stirred in Michael's chest. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said automatically, the words feeling mechanical even to him. "But I'm very busy. If this is about money—" "It's not about money," Emily interrupted, her small hands clenching into fists. "Mom said... She said you needed to know about me. She said you're my father." The words hung in the air like smoke. Michael's fingers tightened on the envelope, crinkling it further. "That's impossible," he said coldly. "Your mother and I, whatever relationship we had, was brief and ended long ago. This is obviously some kind of attempt at—" "She knew you wouldn't believe me," Emily cut in again, reaching into her worn backpack. She pulled out another envelope, this one containing what looked like medical documents. She kept these: birth certificate, blood type, everything she thought you'd need to see that she was telling the truth. Michael stood abruptly, his chair rolling back to hit the wall. This is ridiculous. I don't know what game you and whoever put you up to this are playing, but it ends now. He pressed the intercom button. Mary, call security. Emily didn't move, those familiar brown eyes, so much like his mother's, a voice whispered in his mind, fixed on his face. Mum said you might do this too. She said to tell you about the blue origami crane. Michael's finger froze over the intercom button. The blue crane, a memory he'd buried so deep he thought he'd forgotten it. A silly paper bird he'd made for Jessica during their last night together, before everything changed, before Richard had convinced him that a serious relationship would derail his career. Security is on their way. Mary's voice came through the intercom, sounding uncertain. Emily finally stood, shouldering her backpack. Mom also said that if you didn't believe me, I should tell you to read her letter before making up your mind. She said you owe her that much at least. The security guards appeared in the doorway, but Michael barely noticed them. His eyes were fixed on the worn envelope in his hands, where Jessica's familiar handwriting spelled out his name. Take her out, he managed to say, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. As the guards gently led Emily away, she looked back one last time. I'll be at Mrs. Lucy's boarding house on 28th Street, she said quietly, if you change your mind. The door closed behind her, leaving Michael alone with a letter he didn't want to read and a truth he wasn't ready to face. Michael sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home, the city lights casting shadows across his desk where 2 unopened envelopes lay before him. He'd been staring at them for hours, unable to either read or destroy them. The scotch in his glass, his third, had done nothing to steady his nerves. His phone buzzed. Another message from Richard. Heard about the disturbance today. Everything handled. Michael ignored it, just as he'd ignored the previous 5 messages. Richard's sudden interest in a seemingly minor incident felt suffocating. Finally, with hands that weren't quite steady, he picked up Jessica's letter. The paper was cheap, hospital stationery. He could almost smell the antiseptic through the envelope. Inside, he found several pages covered in Jessica's neat handwriting, now shakier than he remembered. Dear Michael, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe days. I've fought this as long as I could, trying to give Emily more time, trying to find the right moment to tell you, but there's no right moment for news like this, is there? I know you'll be angry that I kept her from you. You have every right to be. But I also remember what Richard told me that day, that I would ruin your future, that everything you'd worked for would crumble if people knew about us, about the baby. He made it very clear what would happen if I didn't disappear. I was young and scared, Michael. When you stopped answering my calls, when every letter came back unopened, I thought I had no choice. I told myself I was protecting both of you. Maybe I was just protecting myself from seeing that look in your eyes, the one that said career meant more than love. Emily is so much like you. Not just her eyes, though she has your mother's eyes just like you do, but her determination, her intelligence. She taught herself to read at 4. Did you know that? She sits for hours with any book she can find, just like you used to do in that old library where we met. I've enclosed her birth certificate and medical records. I know you'll want proof and you should have it, but Michael, when you look at her, really look at her, you'll know. A mother shouldn't have favorites, but that little crease she gets between her eyebrows when she's thinking hard, it's exactly like yours. I'm not asking for money. Mrs. Lucy, my old friend from nursing school, has promised to take care of her. She's a good woman, running that boarding house all alone since her husband died. She'll make sure Emily is safe and loved. All I'm asking is that you read this letter, that you look at our daughter, yes, Michael, our daughter, and make your own choice. Not the choice Richard thinks you should make, not the choice your board of directors would approve of, but yours. Remember that night in the library? You told me your biggest fear wasn't failure, but succeeding at all the wrong things. You were so different then, before Richard took you under his wing, before success became your prison instead of your goal. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. I made my choices too, but Emily deserves to know her father, and you deserve to know your daughter. The rest is up to you. With love, despite everything, Jessica. Michael set the letter down, his hands shaking. Memories he'd suppressed for years came flooding back, Jessica's laugh echoing through library stacks, paper cranes on coffee shop tables, promises whispered in the dark. Then Richard's voice, reasonable and cold. She'll ruin everything we've built. She's nobody, Michael. Think about your future. He'd believed Richard. God help him, he'd believed every word. The intercom buzzed, making him jump. Mr. Foster. Mary's voice was hesitant. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but there's something you should know about Emily Parker. What is it? His voice sounded rough, unfamiliar. I did some checking. It's about Mrs. Lucy's boarding house. There's been a fire. Michael's heart stopped. When? About an hour ago. It's all over the local news. They're saying everyone got out, but... She paused. Sir, they're saying Emily is missing. Michael was on his feet before he realized he'd moved. Get me the address, and Mary, don't tell anyone about this, especially not Richard. As he grabbed his coat, his phone buzzed again. Richard's message made his blood run cold. Got word about a fire on 28th Street. Unfortunate. But maybe it's for the best. Some stories should stay buried. Michael stared at the message, that familiar chill of calculation warring with something he hadn't felt in years, raw, uncontrollable fear. What had Richard done? The city lights blurred as his driver sped through the streets. Michael clutched Jessica's letter in his pocket, her words echoing in his mind. Make your own choice. For the first time in 9 years, he was about to do exactly that. The boarding house on 28th Street was still smoldering when Michael arrived. Fire trucks crowded the narrow street, their red lights painting the scene in surreal flashes. The old brick building stood dark and wounded, water from the firefighters' hoses running black down its facade. A small crowd had gathered behind the police tape, residents wrapped in blankets, neighbors offering coffee and comfort. Michael scanned their faces desperately, looking for Emily's dark hair and determined eyes. She wasn't among them. Excuse me. He approached an elderly woman clutching a singed bathrobe. I'm looking for Emily Parker. She stays here with Mrs. Lucy? The woman's face crumpled. Poor Lucy's at the hospital, smoke inhalation. But Emily... She shook her head. Nobody's seen her since this afternoon. She wasn't in her room when the fire started. Michael's phone buzzed again. Richard. He ignored it, pushing through the crowd toward a firefighter who seemed to be in charge. What caused the fire? The firefighter looked up from his clipboard. Preliminary investigation suggests electrical failure, but he hesitated. There are some inconsistencies. We've called in the fire marshal. Inconsistencies? The fire started in multiple locations simultaneously, and the building's electrical system was recently inspected. It shouldn't have failed like this. Michael's stomach turned. He remembered Richard's message. Some stories should stay buried. How far would his mentor go to protect the carefully crafted image they'd built? A small commotion near the police tape drew his attention. Mary was there, looking completely out of place in her designer suit, arguing with a police officer. Michael hurried over. "Sir," Mary said as soon as she saw him, "I found something. The security footage from the lobby. It shows Emily leaving the building right after meeting with you. She took the subway toward Brooklyn." "Brooklyn? Why would she—" "There's more." Mary lowered her voice. "I did some digging into old records. 9 years ago, Richard made a series of payments to a private investigator. The same week, Jessica Parker suddenly left her job at the library and moved away. No forwarding address. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture Michael didn't want to see. "Get me everything you can find about those payments. And Mary, be careful. Don't let Richard know you're looking." His phone buzzed yet again. This time he answered. "Michael," Richard's voice was smooth as ever. "I heard you're at the fire. Terrible business, but you really shouldn't concern yourself with these unfortunate coincidences. Cut the act, Richard. What did you do? I've only ever done what's best for you, for the company, just like I did 9 years ago when that girl threatened everything we'd built. Jessica didn't threaten anything. You did. You made those threats." Richard's laugh was cold. "I made her see reason, just like I'm trying to make you see reason now. Go home, Michael. Some doors are better left closed." "Where is Emily?" "I'm sure she's fine. Children are remarkably resilient. But if you pursue this, well, New York can be dangerous for a little girl alone." Michael's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. "If anything happens to her, nothing will happen if you make the right choice, just like before. Think about your position, Michael. Your reputation. Would your board support a CEO with a scandal like this? An illegitimate child? A mother he abandoned? You engineered that abandonment. You intercepted her letters, didn't you? Paid people to return them unopened. Made sure I never knew about my own daughter. I did what had to be done, just like now." Richard's voice hardened. "Go home, Michael. Consider this your final warning." The line went dead. Michael stood in the rain that had started falling, feeling the weight of 9 years of manipulation pressing down on him. He'd let Richard shape him into something he barely recognized, a man who would throw away a letter from a dying woman, who would deny his own child. Mary touched his arm gently. "Sir, I found something else." Before she died, Jessica Parker made monthly deposits into a small account at Brooklyn Federal Credit Union. The last withdrawal was made today, by Emily. "She's getting money for something." Michael stared at the ruined boarding house, or running away. His phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Daughter safe, Mrs. Lucy stable, but they won't be if you keep looking. R." Michael showed the message to Mary. "Can you trace this?" She was already typing on her tablet. "The number's encrypted, but—" Her eyes widened. "Sir, it was sent from inside Foster Enterprises. Richard's still at the office." Michael started toward his car, then stopped. Mary, I need you to do something. Get me everything you can find on Richard's dealings for the past decade. Every payment, every threat, every secret he's buried. And contact Sharon in legal. Tell her to prepare documents transferring controlling interest of my shares to a trust. Sir, your shares are worth billions. And they're the only leverage I have against Richard. He won't let go of the company without a fight. Michael looked back at the burning building. But right now, none of that matters. I have to find my daughter before he does. As he drove toward Brooklyn, another text came through. Final warning. Walk away or everything burns. Michael's response was simple. No more warnings, Richard. This ends tonight. What he didn't know was that Richard had already set in motion events that would change everything, and that Emily wasn't running away. She was running towards something far more dangerous than either of them realized. The Brooklyn Federal Credit Union was closed when Michael arrived, its windows dark against the rainy night. He paced outside, feeling helpless as Mary worked her tablet from the car, searching through security footage from nearby cameras. There, she said suddenly. Emily was here around 4 o'clock. She withdrew everything, just under $3,000. Michael leaned over to see the grainy footage. Emily looked so small, standing at the ATM, her worn backpack clutched tight against her chest. Can you see where she went? She got into a taxi. Mary's fingers flew over the screen. I'm tracking it through traffic cameras. She went to the train station. Michael's phone rang, Mrs. Lucy's number. He'd given it to the hospital to call with any updates. Hello? Mr. Foster? The voice was weak, but determined. This is Lucy Matthews. I need to tell you something about Emily. Is she all right? Do you know where she is? She's looking for her mother's journals. Lucy coughed, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. Jessica left them with me for safekeeping. They're evidence, Mr. Foster, of everything Richard Thompson did. Michael's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of evidence? Recordings? Documents? Jessica was smart. She knew Richard might try to bury everything. She kept proof of the threats, the bribes, the people he'd ruined. Not just you and her, but others. So many others. Where are these journals now? I kept them in a safety deposit box. But after the fire, Emily must have remembered me telling Jessica where they were. She's trying to finish what her mother started. Michael's blood ran cold. If Emily had evidence that could destroy Richard. Which bank, Mrs. Lucy? Where's the safety deposit box? Another coughing fit delayed her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. First National, downtown Brooklyn branch, box 647. But Mr. Foster, be careful. Richard has people everywhere. That's how the fire started. I saw them. What do you mean? 2 men. They came looking for Emily, but she was already gone. They searched her room, then... She paused to catch her breath. I saw them tampering with something in the electrical box. Minutes later, everything was burning. Michael's hand shook as he ended the call. He showed Mary the text from the unknown number again. You said this came from inside Foster Enterprises. Can you narrow it down? She typed rapidly. The signal bounced through several servers, but it originated from the executive floor, specifically from outside your office. The security desk, where Tom Jenkins has worked for the past 15 years, hired personally by Richard. Michael started the car. Call Sharon in legal. Tell her I need those transfer documents now. And get me everything you can find on Jenkins. As they drove toward First National, Mary's tablet chimed repeatedly. Sir, these records about Jenkins, he's not just security, he's ex-military, specialized in making problems disappear. Richard's clean-up man, Michael said grimly. How many others? How many lives has he ruined to protect his precious company? I'm finding more payments. Shell companies, offshore accounts. Sir, some of these go back decades. Before you even joined the company. Michael thought of all the rivals who'd mysteriously backed out of deals, the whistleblowers who'd suddenly retracted their statements, the accidents that had always seemed to benefit Foster Enterprises. How had he been so blind? They were 3 blocks from First National when Mary gasped. Sir, security cameras at the bank. Emily's there now, but she's not alone. Michael looked at the live feed on her tablet. Emily stood at the bank's night deposit box, her small figure illuminated by streetlights. Behind her, partially hidden in shadows, 2 men watched. One was unmistakably Tom Jenkins. Call the police, Michael ordered, pressing the accelerator. Already did, but the nearest patrol is 10 minutes out. She doesn't have 10 minutes. Michael pulled up to the curb, leaving the engine running. Stay here. If anything happens, I'll send everything we have on Richard to every news outlet in the country, Mary finished. Be careful, sir. Michael stepped into the rain, his heart pounding. Emily was so focused on the deposit box that she didn't notice the men approaching. Jenkins reached into his jacket, and moonlight glinted off something metallic. Emily! Michael shouted. Get down! She turned, startled. And that's when all hell broke loose. A gun fired, the sound echoing off wet pavement. Glass shattered. And Richard Thompson stepped out of the shadows, holding what looked like a small leather book. I told you some stories should stay buried, Michael, he said calmly, as Emily scrambled for cover behind a concrete pillar. Now I'll have to bury them myself. Rain pounded the pavement as Michael stood between Richard and the pillar where Emily had taken cover. His expensive suit was soaked through, but he barely noticed. All he could focus on was Jenkins' gun, still aimed in their direction, and the leather journal in Richard's hands. It's over, Richard, Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. The police are on their way. Richard's laugh was hollow. The police? Michael, I've been managing the police in this city longer than you've been alive. Why do you think Jessica could never file a complaint? Why do you think her accusations never went anywhere? Behind the pillar, Emily's eyes were wide with fear, but there was determination there too. So much like her mother, so much like him before Richard had molded him into something else. All these years, Michael said, taking a careful step forward. How many others were there? How many lives did you destroy to build your empire? I built everything. Richard's composed facade cracked slightly. I took this company from nothing. Do you think your father could have done it? That drunk couldn't manage a corner store. I saved Foster Enterprises. I saved you. You destroyed me, Michael corrected. Turned me into someone who would abandon his own child, someone who would ignore a dying woman's last request. Jenkins shifted position, keeping his gun trained on Michael. Mr. Thompson, we need to finish this. Police response time in this district is 8 minutes, even with their usual delays. Richard nodded, opening the journal. Jessica was quite thorough. Names, dates, recordings. She documented everything. Poor girl thought it would be her insurance policy. He pulled out a lighter. She never understood. Evidence only matters if someone's alive to present it. Don't. Emily's voice rang out. She had stepped partially out from behind the pillar. "Those are my mother's. They're all I have left of her." Something in her voice made even Jenkins hesitate. Michael saw his chance and took another step toward Richard. "Think about what you're doing. She's just a child." "She's a loose end," Richard said coldly, "just like her mother was. Jessica wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't take the money I offered. She actually thought love was more important than success." He looked at Michael with something like pity. "She would have ruined you." "She would have saved me," Michael whispered, "from becoming this." The lighter flicked open. Richard held it to the journal's corner. "Sometimes we have to burn the past to protect the future, Michael. I taught you that." "No!" Emily darted out from her hiding place, running toward Richard. Jenkins swung his gun toward her. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Michael launched himself forward, seeing Jenkins' finger tighten on the trigger. He reached Emily just as the shot rang out, spinning them both behind a concrete planter. Pain exploded in his shoulder, hot and sharp. "Daddy!" Emily's scream pierced the night. It was the first time she had called him that. Richard's voice carried over the rain. "Finish it, Jenkins, both of them. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong." But Jenkins was looking up at something behind them, his face suddenly pale. "Sir, the cameras." Mary stood at the bank's entrance, her tablet held high. "Live streaming to every major news network," she announced. "And I've just sent 9 years' worth of financial records, surveillance footage, and witness statements to the FBI. Would you like to see the viewer count, Mr. Thompson? It's quite impressive." Police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Richard's face contorted with rage. He threw the journal aside and reached into his jacket. "No!" Jenkins grabbed his arm. "Sir, we have to go, now!" They ran for a black SUV parked nearby, tires squealing as they pulled away. Michael barely noticed, focused entirely on Emily's tear-stained face above him. "You're hurt," she whispered, pressing her small hands against his bleeding shoulder. "I'm okay," he managed, though the pain was intense. Are you all right?" She nodded, then buried her face in his chest, sobbing. Michael held her with his good arm, feeling her whole body shake. "I've got you," he murmured. "I'm here now. I'm so sorry I wasn't before." Mary knelt beside them, already calling an ambulance. She had retrieved Jessica's journal, somehow undamaged. "Sir, you need to lie still. You're losing blood." But Michael couldn't lie still. Not yet. He had to tell Emily, had to make her understand. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough with pain and emotion. "About you. About what Richard did to your mother. I should have known, should have looked harder, fought harder. Mom said..." Emily hiccuped, trying to control her tears. "Mom said you used to be different before him. I was, and I will be again, if you'll give me a chance." Emily's answer was lost in the chaos of arriving police cars and paramedics. As they loaded Michael into an ambulance, he refused to let go of her hand. He'd let go once before, let Richard separate him from the people who mattered most. Never again. But even as the ambulance doors closed, Mary's tablet chimed with one final message from an unknown number. "This isn't over." Some fires can't be extinguished so easily. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and Emily's soft breathing. She had fallen asleep in the chair beside Michael's bed, her small hand still clutching his. The doctors had wanted to send her to child services, but Michael had refused to let her out of his sight. One call from Mary to his lawyers had secured temporary emergency custody. His shoulder throbbed beneath the bandages. The bullet had gone clean through, missing any major arteries. Lucky, the doctors had said. But Michael didn't feel lucky. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jenkins' gun pointing at Emily, heard Richard's cold order to finish it. Mary entered silently, tablet in hand as always. Her usual professional demeanor was cracked, showing genuine concern. "How are you feeling, sir?" "Like I've been shot." He attempted to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "Any news?" "Richard and Jenkins haven't been found. They abandoned the SUV in Queens, but—" She hesitated, glancing at Emily's sleeping form. "Tell me." 3 board members received messages this morning. Richard is claiming you're mentally unstable, that you fabricated this whole situation to cover up embezzlement. He's calling for an emergency board meeting to remove you as CEO. Michael wasn't surprised. It was exactly the kind of manipulation Richard excelled at. And the evidence? Jessica's journal, being analyzed by the FBI. But sir, there's something else. The journal mentions other children, other situations that Richard handled for various executives over the years. The company's image. "To hell with the company's image," Michael said quietly, careful not to wake Emily. "What about Mrs. Lucy? Is she safe?" "Under police protection at the hospital, but her doctors are worried. The smoke damage to her lungs. They're not sure she'll recover fully." Emily stirred slightly in her sleep, her face troubled. Michael gently smoothed her hair, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, how fierce his need to protect her had become. Just days ago, he had been the kind of man who would have thrown away her mother's letter without reading it. "Sir," Mary continued, even softer, "the board meeting is tomorrow. Given your condition, they'll vote without you present. I've prepared a statement. No statements." Michael's voice was firm. "Have Sharon bring the share transfer documents. It's time. But sir, your controlling interest in the company, it's worth nothing compared to her safety." He looked at Emily's sleeping face. "Richard will use every resource he has to destroy us. The only way to stop him is to take away those resources." A nurse entered to check his vitals, frowning at how many people were in the room. As she worked, Emily began to whimper in her sleep. "No, please, the fire." "Shh," Michael soothed, ignoring the pain as he reached out to touch her cheek. "You're safe, I've got you." Her eyes fluttered open, momentarily confused. Then she saw him and launched herself forward, hugging him tightly. He couldn't hold back a gasp of pain, but he didn't let go. "I had a bad dream," she whispered against his hospital gown. "Richard was there, and the fire, and Mom." "I know, sweetheart, I know." The endearment felt natural, right? "But we're going to be okay." The nurse cleared her throat. "Sir, she really shouldn't be on the bed. Hospital regulations—" "She stays," Michael said with quiet authority. To his surprise, the nurse's stern expression softened as she looked at them. "Just be careful of the IV lines," she said before leaving. Mary waited until they were alone again. "The FBI wants to interview Emily about what she remembers, and Child Services will need to evaluate your home situation before—" "No." Emily's voice was small but determined. "I want to stay with my dad." The word hit Michael like a physical blow. Dad. He didn't deserve it. Not after 9 years of absence. Not after nearly turning her away. But he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. His phone lit up with a message. Unknown number again. "Board meets at 9 a.m. One last chance, Michael. Sign the company over to me, deny everything, and this all goes away. Otherwise—" "Well, hospitals can be dangerous places. Accidents happen." Emily saw the message and stiffened. Michael deleted it and pulled her closer. "He can't hurt us anymore," he promised, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. Richard was still out there, still dangerous. "Your father." Emily hesitated. "Mom said he was a good man once, before Richard." "I'm trying to be that man again," Michael said softly. "If you'll help me." She nodded against his chest, and for a moment everything else faded away, the pain, the threats, the uncertain future. Then Mary's tablet chimed with an urgent alert. "Sir?" Her face had gone pale. "The hospital's security system just went down, all of it. Cameras, locks, everything." Michael's heart began to race. "Call the police, now." But even as Mary dialed, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching the room. And they were running out of time to escape. The hospital corridor lights flickered ominously as Michael forced himself to stand, fighting waves of dizziness. His shoulders screamed in protest, fresh blood seeping through the bandages. Emily watched him with worried eyes, but didn't say a word as Mary helped him disconnect the IV. "The service elevator," Mary whispered, her phone pressed to her ear. "Police are 7 minutes out, but we don't have 7 minutes." Michael could hear those footsteps getting closer, accompanied by the sound of doors being methodically checked. He turned to Emily. "Sweetheart, I need you to be very brave. Can you do that?" She nodded, her face pale but determined, just like Jessica, facing down impossible odds without flinching. Michael's heart ached at how much time he'd lost, how many moments like this he'd missed. They slipped into the hallway, moving as quietly as possible toward the service area. Michael's vision swam with each step, but he forced himself to keep going. Emily held his hand, occasionally tugging him in the right direction when the pain made him falter. A door slammed somewhere behind them, followed by a familiar voice. "Check every room. They're still here somewhere." Jenkins, and where Jenkins was, Richard wouldn't be far behind. The service elevator was at the end of a long corridor lined with supply closets. Michael's hospital gown was soaked with sweat and blood, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. Just 20 more steps. 15. 10. A nurse emerged from a room ahead, her eyes widening at the sight of them. Before she could speak, Mary stepped forward, pressing a finger to her lips and showing her FBI badge. When had she gotten that? The nurse nodded once and ducked back into the room. 5 steps. The elevator was right there. "Michael!" Richard's voice echoed from around the corner. "Let's talk about this reasonably, like we always have." Emily's hand tightened in his. Michael pushed her gently toward Mary, who was already calling the elevator. "You're hurt," Richard continued, closer now. "You're not thinking clearly. Let me help you, like I've always helped you." "By destroying more lives?" Michael's voice was hoarse but carried clearly. "By threatening children? I protected you, protected the company. Everything I did was for you." The elevator dinged softly. Mary pulled Emily inside, but the girl resisted. "Daddy, please, go," Michael whispered. "I'll be right behind you." Richard's footsteps stopped just around the corner. "You know, it's funny. Jessica said almost the same thing that night, that she was trying to protect you. Right before she signed those papers, giving up all claims to support. Right before she disappeared." "You forced her," Michael growled. "Threatened her. I gave her a choice, just like I'm giving you a choice now." The elevator doors started to close. Emily was crying silently, reaching for him. Mary held her back, her own eyes bright with tears. "What choice?" Michael asked, buying time, praying the doors would close before Richard rounded that corner. Sign the company over to me, all of it. Walk away with the girl, live your domestic fantasy, or don't, and well, history has a way of repeating itself. The elevator doors were almost shut when Jenkins appeared at the far end of the corridor, gun raised. At the same moment, Richard stepped around the corner. Michael did the only thing he could. He lunged forward, tackling Richard just as Jenkins fired. They crashed into a supply cart, medical supplies scattering across the floor. Pain exploded through Michael's shoulder, but he held on. "You're bleeding out," Richard observed coldly, struggling beneath him. "How long do you think you can keep this up?" "Long enough." Michael's vision was going dark at the edges, but he could hear police sirens getting closer. "It's over, Richard. All of it." Jenkins was running toward them, but his foot hit a patch of spilled antiseptic. He went down hard, his gun skidding across the floor, right to Richard's reaching hand. "Nothing's over until I say it is." Richard pressed the gun to Michael's chest, right over his heart. "I made you. I can unmake you just as easily." The last thing Michael saw before consciousness faded was the elevator doors reopening. Emily stood there, Jessica's journal clutched to her chest, something fierce and unbreakable in her eyes. "You didn't make him," she said clearly. "My mom saved him, and now I'm going to save him too." Then everything went black. When Michael opened his eyes again, he was back in a hospital bed. Different room. Different hospital, according to the sign he could see through the window. Emily was there, asleep with her head on his bed. Jessica's journal still held tight. "Hey," Mary appeared in his field of vision. "Welcome back." "Richard," his voice was barely a whisper. "In custody, along with Jenkins." Turns out Emily had been recording everything on her phone, just like her mother used to do. The whole confrontation, all his threats. It's over, really over. Michael looked down at his sleeping daughter, gently touching her hair. "How long was I?" 3 days. She hasn't left your side, not once." Mary's voice softened. "The doctors said you're lucky. Again. The bullet in your shoulder reopened. You lost a lot of blood, but you gained something too. The board voted this morning. With Richard's arrest and Emily's recording going viral, they had no choice. You're still CEO, if you want to be." Michael didn't answer. He was watching Emily sleep, thinking of all the mornings he'd missed, all the moments he could have had if he'd just been brave enough to defy Richard years ago. If he'd just read Jessica's letter. "Sir," Mary pressed, "about the company." "The company can wait," he said softly. "Right now, I just want to be her father." But even as he said it, a nurse entered with a strange expression. "Mr. Foster, there's something you need to see. Something about Emily's mother." And Michael knew, somehow, that this story wasn't over yet. The nurse held a thick manila envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "This was found during the investigation at Mrs. Lucy's boarding house. It was in a fireproof safe, badly damaged, but intact." Michael took the envelope carefully, mindful of his injured shoulder. Emily had woken up and was watching with wide eyes, her small hand still holding his. "Should I?" He looked at Emily uncertainly. "Open it," she whispered. "Mum always said there was more we needed to know when the time was right." Inside the envelope were medical records, letters, and a DVD labeled simply, "For Michael and Emily." Mary quickly set up her laptop, her usually steady hands fumbling slightly with the disc. Jessica's face appeared on the screen, clearly recorded in a hospital room. She was thin, so thin, her once vibrant features hollowed by illness. But her eyes, Emily's eyes, were as determined as ever. Michael, if you're watching this, then everything I feared about Richard has come true, and Emily has found her way to you. She smiled sadly. I hope you can forgive me for keeping her from you, but there's something else you need to know. Emily pressed closer to Michael as her mother's voice filled the room. The cancer wasn't a surprise, Jessica continued. I knew it was coming. It's genetic, the same type that took my mother and her mother before her. There's a 50% chance that Emily... She paused, composing herself. That's why I've arranged everything with Dr. Sarah Chen at Memorial Hospital. She's been monitoring Emily since birth. All her records are there. Michael felt Emily stiffen beside him. He pulled her closer, his heart racing. It's okay, he whispered. We'll face this together. Michael, Jessica's voice grew urgent. Emily needs regular screening. Dr. Chen has all the protocols, all the preventive measures we've been taking. Richard, he knew about this too. It's part of why he wanted me gone. A CEO's daughter with a genetic predisposition to cancer? It would have scared investors, he said, made the company vulnerable. Tears were streaming down Emily's face now. Michael wiped them away gently, his own vision blurring. But that's not all, Jessica continued. The night Richard forced me to leave, I was trying to tell you something. I'd just gotten back from Dr. Chen's office. Emily, she has a sibling, a twin. The room went completely still. Emily's grip on Michael's hand became almost painful. The pregnancy was high risk. The doctors advised selective reduction, but I couldn't choose. One baby was slightly smaller, weaker. They didn't think she would survive, but she did. Both of my girls did. Girls, Michael whispered. Richard knew about both babies. He arranged for the smaller twin to be adopted immediately after birth. Said it was better this way. One child could disappear with me, the other would have a chance at a normal life. He promised she went to a good home, but I was never allowed to know where or who. Mary was already typing frantically on her tablet, searching records, but Michael could hardly focus on that. A twin, another daughter, another life Richard had stolen from them. Her name, Jessica's voice cracked. I named her Grace. The adoption papers are in here too, but Richard had them sealed. I've spent years trying to find her, to make sure she gets the same medical care Emily does, because if Emily inherited the genetic marker, then Grace did. Emily spoke for the first time since the video started. Did I inherit it? Michael pulled her onto his lap, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. We'll find out. We'll get you tested, get you whatever care you need. Both of you, once we find her. There's more, Mary said, looking up from her tablet. Dr. Chen, she's been monitoring another patient, a girl the same age as Emily, adopted at birth. She's been getting the exact same preventive treatments. Where? Michael demanded. Boston Children's Hospital. Her adoptive parents knew about the genetic risk. They've been working with Dr. Chen this whole time, but they never knew about Emily. Richard kept everything separated, controlled. On the screen, Jessica wiped her eyes. I'm running out of time. Emily, my brave girl. I'm so sorry I won't be there to see you grow up, to see you find your sister, but I know that somehow you'll find your way to your father. And Michael, please, find Grace. Keep our daughters safe. Love them like I would have. The screen went dark, but Jessica's presence seemed to linger in the room. Emily buried her face in Michael's chest, her small body shaking with sobs. Daddy, she finally whispered. Do you think she looks like me? We'll find out, he promised, his voice rough with emotion. We'll find her, Emily, no matter what it takes. Mary was already making calls, her professional mask cracking with each revelation. Sir, Grace's adoptive parents, they're flying in tomorrow. They want to meet. Michael held Emily tighter, thinking of another little girl out there, possibly facing the same medical challenges, the same uncertainties. Richard had tried to split them apart, but somehow, across all these years, they had stayed connected through Jessica's careful planning, through a mother's love that reached beyond death itself. First, he said firmly, we're getting Emily tested. Then we'll face whatever comes next, together. But even as he made these plans, his phone lit up with one final message. Twins. Did you really think that was the last secret, Michael? The waiting room at Memorial Hospital felt too small, too sterile for the magnitude of what was about to happen. Emily sat beside Michael, both of them still wearing hospital gowns. He for his shoulder, she for the genetic testing she'd just completed. Her hand hadn't left his since the blood draw. What if she doesn't like me? Emily whispered, smoothing her gown for the 100th time. What if her parents don't want her to know me? Michael squeezed her hand gently. Anyone who knows you loves you, he said simply, just like I do. The words came naturally now, though he'd struggled with them at first. How do you make up for 9 years of absence? But Emily, with her mother's capacity for forgiveness, had made it easy. Mary entered, her usual professional demeanor softened by the circumstances. They're here. Emily's grip tightened painfully. Through the glass doors, Michael could see a couple speaking with Dr. Chen, the Winters, David and Sarah, Grace's adoptive parents, and between them, Emily gasped softly. The girl looked exactly like her, down to the small crease between her eyebrows as she listened to the adults talking. The same dark hair, the same determined set to her jaw. Only her clothes were different, new and clearly expensive where Emily's were second-hand. The doors opened. Both girls froze, staring at each other with identical expressions of wonder. Grace, Sarah Winters said gently, there's someone we'd like you to meet. But Grace was already moving, drawn to her twin like a magnet. They met in the middle of the waiting room, neither speaking, just looking. Then, simultaneously, they reached out to touch each other's faces, as if making sure the other was real. I used to dream about you, Grace whispered. Mom, Sarah, said it was normal for adopted kids to imagine having a sister, but I knew. Somehow I always knew. The Winters approached Michael, their faces a mix of emotions. We never knew, David said quietly, about Emily, about Jessica. Richard told us Grace was an only child, that her birth mother didn't want any contact. He told us a lot of things, Sarah added, watching the girls who had now sat down together, talking in hushed, urgent voices. But lately, Grace has been asking questions, hard ones, about her medical treatments, about her birth family. Then we saw the news about Richard's arrest, about Emily. The genetic testing, Michael said. Have you? Sarah nodded. Grace tested positive for the marker last year. We've been working with Dr. Chen on preventive measures, but Mr. Foster? Dr. Chen appeared with a tablet in her hands. Her face was carefully neutral. Emily's results are ready. Michael felt his heart stop. The girls looked up, sensing the tension. Emily came back to his side, and to everyone's surprise, Grace came with her, holding her twin's hand. The genetic marker, Dr. Chen began, is present in Emily's DNA. The words hit like physical blows. Emily swayed slightly, but Grace steadied her. "It's okay," Grace said firmly. "I have it too. We'll face it together." Michael pulled Emily close, extending his arm to include Grace. The girl hesitated only a moment before joining their embrace. The Winters watched with tears in their eyes. "We have extensive experience dealing with this," Dr. Chen continued. "With early monitoring and preventive treatment, the prognosis is good. Both girls have excellent chances of—" She was interrupted by Michael's phone ringing. Private number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Touching scene," Richard's voice came through, smooth as ever despite being in jail. "The happy family reunion? But did you really think I'd let it end there?" Michael's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Jessica's journal. Did you read all of it? The part about the experimental treatment she was receiving while pregnant? About why the girl's DNA is so special?" "What did you do?" Michael demanded, his voice drawing everyone's attention. Richard's laugh was cold. "I didn't do anything, but those treatments, they were funded by someone who's been watching these girls their whole lives, waiting to see if the experiments worked." And now that they've found each other. A commotion in the hallway made Michael look up. Men in dark suits were approaching from both directions, led by a familiar face. James Chen, Dr. Chen's husband, and the head of one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. "I had to tell him they were together," Richard continued. "You understand, don't you? Business is business." "Security!" Mary shouted, but it was too late. The men were already in the waiting room, surrounding them. "Mr. Foster," James Chen said smoothly, "we need to discuss your daughter's participation in some ongoing medical research. Their genetic markers are unique. The result of treatments their mother received, treatments my company funded." "You're not touching them," Michael growled, pulling both girls behind him despite his injured shoulder. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. The legal documents Jessica signed during her treatment give us certain rights." Emily and Grace clung to each other, their faces identical masks of fear. The Winters moved to stand with Michael, forming a protective circle around the girls. "Actually," Mary's voice cut through the tension, "he does have a choice." She held up her tablet. "Because I just found Jessica's last will, the one Richard hid, and you're not going to believe what it says." Mary's fingers flew across her tablet as she pulled up the document. "Jessica wasn't just receiving treatments," she announced. "She was a research partner. Her background in biochemistry, which Richard conveniently erased from all public records, meant she understood exactly what was being done, and she left very specific instructions." James Chen's confident smile faltered slightly. Michael kept both girls behind him, feeling their small hands clutching his hospital gown. "According to this," Mary continued, "Jessica developed key elements of the treatment protocol herself. She held patents that Richard helped suppress, patents that upon her death transferred to her daughters." "That's impossible," Chen snapped. "We own all the patents. Richard assured us—" "Richard lied," Mary said simply. "He's been lying to everyone for years. Jessica knew he would try to bury her work, so she filed everything under her maiden name. International patents, all legally transferred to a trust for Emily and Grace. A trust that just became active when the girls found each other." The suited men looked uncertainly at Chen, waiting for instructions. He pulled out his phone, probably to call his lawyers, but Mary wasn't finished. "Oh, and those legal documents you mentioned?" The ones giving you rights to the girl's genetic material? She swiped to another screen. They required Jessica's continued consent, which ended with her death. Any attempt to enforce them now would be kidnapping and medical battery of minors. Would you like me to forward this to the FBI agents who are currently in the building? Chen's face had gone pale. This isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Those treatments could save lives. The research can continue, Michael interrupted, with proper oversight and consent from their legal guardian. He looked down at Emily and Grace, seeing Jessica's strength in their matching, determined expressions. We'll set up a foundation, use the patent royalties to fund ethical research, help other families affected by the same genetic condition. But nobody touches my daughters without their consent. The Winters stepped forward. Both our families, David said firmly. We'll work together for both girls. Chen looked around the room, seeing his position crumbling. The suited men were already backing away, no one wanting to be involved in the attempted kidnapping of a CEO's daughters, especially not with FBI agents nearby investigating Richard's other crimes. This isn't what Richard promised, Chen muttered, but he was already retreating. Richard promised a lot of things, Michael said, but he never understood what really matters. After Chen and his men left, after the excitement died down and the FBI had taken statements, the two families sat together in Michael's hospital room. Emily and Grace had not let go of each other, sharing stories in the rapid-fire way of siblings making up for lost time. They'll need to be monitored, Dr. Chen, Sarah's sister it turned out, which was how the Winters had found her in the first place, explained. The genetic marker is serious but manageable. Especially now that we understand Jessica's research better. She was brilliant. She left us everything we need to help them. We'll have to figure out logistics, Sarah Winters said. Schools, visits, medical appointments. We'll move, Michael said immediately. Both girls looked up, hope blazing in their identical faces. The Boston office needs a CEO anyway. I'll be closer to the hospital, and the girls can be together. Really? Emily and Grace asked simultaneously. Really, he promised. No more separation, no more secrets. Later that night, after the Winters had left to arrange Grace's transfer to Memorial for observation, after Emily had finally fallen asleep in the recliner that the nurses had brought in specially, Michael sat looking at Jessica's journal. So many secrets, so much love and sacrifice hidden in these pages. His phone lit up, Mary, with an update from the FBI. Richard had attempted suicide in his cell after learning his last plan had failed. He'd survived barely and was now under psychiatric hold. Jenkins had agreed to testify against him. The company's stocks were stable. The board was supportive. None of it seemed to matter much anymore. Emily stirred in her sleep, smiling slightly. She was dreaming of her sister, Michael knew. They'd already developed that uncanny twin connection, communicating without words, understanding each other instinctively. Just like he and Jessica once had, before he'd let Richard corrupt that connection. He looked at the journal again, at Jessica's last written words. Love is stronger than ambition, truer than success. I hope they all find that truth someday. We did, he whispered to her memory. Late, but we did. Emily's eyes fluttered open. Daddy, is Grace coming back tomorrow? Yes, sweetheart. And the day after, and the day after that. We're a family now, all of us. She smiled, drifting back to sleep. Michael watched his daughter, one of his daughters, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the cold emptiness he'd mistaken for peace during his years under Richard's influence, but real peace. The kind that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and what matters most. Outside his window, the city sparkled with life and possibility. Tomorrow would bring challenges, medical treatments, legal battles over patents, the complex logistics of blending two families. But those challenges would be faced together, with love instead of ambition, truth instead of manipulation, family instead of power. Jessica had known all along what Richard never understood, that true success isn't measured in dollars or deals, but in the connections we forge, the love we share, and the legacy we leave for our children. Not in corporate empires, but in moments like this, watching your daughter sleep, knowing her sister is safe nearby, feeling the warmth of belonging to something bigger than yourself. Michael settled back in his hospital bed, Jessica's journal held close. For the first time since he'd let Richard reshape his life, he felt truly, completely whole. There would be hard days ahead, but they would face them as a family. Together, just as Jessica had always hoped they would be. And somewhere he knew she was smiling.